Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking from Washington, D.C. Program being recorded here on Friday, the 21st of September. And this means that the first time you can hear this broadcast, it's going to be the 22nd of September, and a great day, the day that President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the warning to the Confederate slavocrat power that unless they stopped their rebellion against the United States, slavery would be abolished in their territories. And of course, they refused to take the warning, and therefore the Emancipation Proclamation went into full force on January 1st, 1863. We just had in the past week, as we pointed out, on the 17th, a couple of days ago, the anniversary of the Antietam battle, not far from where I'm speaking to you from. The biggest single day's battle in American history in any war, World War I, World War II, does not matter. Antietam is bigger than any of them. It's also bigger than any of the individual days at Gettysburg or Shiloh or the Wilderness or Cold Harbor or any other battle. It's a landmark, and it's a landmark to the radicalization of the Civil War. If sacrifices like these are going to be made, then cabinet warfare cannot be the answer. It's got to be a principled struggle for profound social reform in the Confederate States so that hopefully the problem would not be repeated. Now, unfortunately, Lincoln was assassinated before he could win the peace with his concept of Reconstruction, which would have meant the industrialization of the southern states, breaking the slavocrat power with economic development and increase in population, and land reform, I would say, for the newly freed slaves. In other words, the famous 40 acres and a mule, which was implemented by Sherman in certain areas when he could, that was the answer, to create a prosperous class of small farmers and to extend the Homestead Act from the public lands of the Midwest, extend that into these slave plantations, break them up. This was attempted by Thaddeus Stevens, the guiding light of Gettysburg College here up the road, right? One of the radical Republicans. He's vilified as being vindictive. The breakup of these plantations of the Confederate leaders and the creation of a class of small farmers among the freed former slaves, that would have been the answer to break the backwardness of the Southern system, which is otherwise with us still today. So we've heard the slogan, the answer to 1984 is 1776. Partly true, but 1776 by itself is not enough, as the Civil War shows beyond any argument. There was something missing in the 1776 and the 1788 Constitution, something more, and that had to be the prohibition of slavery and the 14th Amendment that the slavocrats and their libertarians today, the leprechaun Ron Paul, want to abolish the 14th Amendment because it prevents states from depriving people of life, liberty, property without due process of law. No, the state is not, the individual federal state is not allowed to run wild inside its own territory. The 14th Amendment makes specific the call that each state has the right and the duty to maintain a republican form of government, not a slave oligarchy and not a theocracy either, as Brigham Young attempted to create out there in Deseret. So, big day on the 22nd. Be proud of Lincoln, the greatest man of the 19th century, and somebody that we can learn from in the troubled times ahead. Now, the big news of the past few days, the National Anti-Austerity Committees, the National Anti-Austerity United Front, the Anti-Austerity United Front, the name is still a work in progress. This will have a launch, an initial meeting, a preliminary convention which is going to be held in New York City. Mark your calendars and save the date. It will be New York City, October 27th, about 5 weeks away. October 27th in New York City. The area is Tribeca, Canal Street, just below Canal Street. 56 Walker Street will be the premises. This will be an organizing conference. This will not be a bunch of droning speakers. This is for political discussion, to actually hammer out a program of struggle, not information, but a way to mobilize and a way to intervene, in particular, since the election is a lost cause, or at least it's largely a lost cause, to intervene in the anti-austerity struggles that we're going to need during the lame duck session. We know that Obama has already said he's eager to sell you out with a grand bargain with reactionary and proto-fascist Republicans. Appeasement, unbelievable. But he's running on that. He said so in his convention speech. Eager for a grand bargain. And what it's going to mean is some tiny, tiny symbolic tax on oligarchs, right? A 1% increase on some tax that oligarchs pay. And in exchange for that, massive rape of the middle class and complete destruction, at least beginning of the complete destruction, of your economic rights, your Medicare, your Medicaid, your unemployment benefits, your minimum wage, your Social Security, your Pell Grants, and everything with it, your Head Start, your WIC, and so forth. That's what it's going to be. That's the grand bargain. A little bit of a tax cut on the super rich to provide some political cover for the demagogue Obama, and then massive cuts for the middle class, and yet another attack on the New Deal, the New Frontier, and the Great Society. So this is an organizing conference. It is not there to impart information. I shudder when I hear people say, thanks for the information. The problem with information is there's too much of it. We need concepts, and above all, you've got to come out of it with a concept of how to organize and a commitment to do it, to build the united front. This is going to be, if it works, it's going to be a united front of various organizations. Some are unions, some are political organizations, some are the shards left over from Occupy, other kinds of groups, community groups, individuals. We may even have some drifting politicians from the existing parties. They can be in, but not the Democratic Party and not the Republican Party. They're not welcome. But people who break off from them, obviously, have got to be part of the picture. So mark your calendar. All of the details are in flux, so don't send me a bunch of emails demanding total details. There will be a website for this soon. When? Soon. This is not what I'm doing. Others are doing it. I can't control it. I can't predict it. But they'll be, and I don't even know the name of it. It'll be something like New Deal Coalition or Against Austerity or Anti-Austerity. There's, of course, even a problem with the name austerity, since most people don't know what austerity means, right? Part of this is no cuts. But this is not just economic program. Economic program is, of course, the centerpiece. But you know what we need if you've been listening, right? The economic program alone is not sufficient. You've also got to have organization, leadership, and a strategy. And all those things that the anarchists at Occupy Wall Street told you that you can't have and that you shouldn't even want to have. So that's what we'll be doing. Talk about this more later in the program, because then we have something else that we've got to get to right away. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So we're celebrating September 22nd, the pre-Emancipation Proclamation, the beginning of the destruction of the slavocrat power, the Confederate Freemasons, the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite, loyal to London and to imperialism. So that's setting the stage. October 27th, New York City, Tribeca, south of Canal Street, 56 Walker Street. will be the organizing conference or the initial organizing conference for the Anti-Austerity United Front. We've got to have a defensive line created before the month of December so that we can at least mount a propaganda resistance against Obama's grand bargain with the fascisto Republicans in the Congress, basically to destroy the New Deal entitlements, to strip you of your economic rights after running a campaign being friendly to the middle class. This is what you can expect. The knife will go into your back, and it will be done. He'll be eager to do it, as he said. So the moment is propitious. We've just had, of course, the collapse of Ron Paul. This thing has ended in ignominy. We're told that one of his top campaign officials, one of his nepotists, Jesse Benton, has now gone to work for Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell, the greatest plutocrat in the Senate, right? The guy who says that money is speech, and he wants no limits at all about the amount of money that can flow into the campaign coffers and indeed the pockets of his reactionary and fascistoid Republican confrere there in the Senate. So that's where parts of the Ron Paul campaign have ended up. This is the ignominious collapse of libertarianism, right? Showing what it was all along. On the other hand, we've also just had the 1-year anniversary of the failed Occupy Wall Street. Now, I don't say this with any gloating, but I tried to salvage it before, during, and after with program, organization, leadership, and a strategy. And naturally, the ad busters of Vancouver, right, the Kalle Lazens and the Schmaltz brigade up there in Vancouver, they didn't want any part of it. They wanted to go with situationist international counterinsurgency tactics, culture jamming, détournement, facilitators, the straitjacket of the consensus method. Let me just say in parenthesis, the October 27th conference in New York City will not, repeat, not be ruled by the consensus method. It'll be majority rules. Whatever that turns out to be will be it. Whether you like it, whether I like it, whether anybody likes it, you've got to be able to make decisions and get to work and move along, get moving fast and hit hard when it comes to fighting for class defense. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to set up a class defense front. So this past Tuesday, I believe, was the day. That was the first anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. And I found, being in New York on that same day for the pro-Syria event that was held at Theater 80 on 80 St. Mark's Place. Very interesting operation there, and a fairly well-attended event, considering the amount of resources put into it. Thank you to all who attended, many listeners of this program. Here we've got Our Town. Remember Our Town? Well, Our Town is still there. This is the Our Town Downtown edition, right? This is a free newspaper from New York City. What is the legacy of Occupy Wall Street? With the first-year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street looming, writer Matt Harvey examines the true power of the Occupy movement. And he points out that this started off with this occupation, always a complete programmatic vacuum, and that as the time went on, more and more sort of militant anarchists came in particular the Black Bloc, and we reported about Black Bloc at the time, right? These are anarchist wreckers. These are people who do the work of the ruling elite. The Black Bloc comes in, and they first of all, they're channeling disaffection with the current economic system. Then they try to create a new type of urban protest community. It's not new. It's called the hippie commune. Nothing new about it. Then the money came in. You could get free lunch. A lot of panhandlers show up. And then we get the Black Bloc coming in, and with the Black Bloc, their goal is to offend the middle class. Here's what we read. The smell of weed was always in the air, and the political causes on display, especially as the so-called Black Bloc anarchists moved in, aimed to offend middle-class sensibilities. That's what culture jamming means. Let's épater la bourgeoisie, right? We'll freak out the middle class by putting on some kind of an obscene spectacle. That's just great. That's really going to help the people out there who need medical care, defend their home against foreclosure, pay a tuition bill, and get some unemployment benefits. That's really great. This is the nothingness of the petty bourgeois student anarchist rebellion. And this thing has now played out its logic to complete impotence. And I must say I've seen this before in the 60s and then even later in other countries. All right. So Harvey, I think this is an interesting article, realistic. Post-eviction, Occupy's trajectory towards obsolescence has been equally rapid, begging the question of whether the movement was able to achieve anything meaningful during its short lifespan. Certainly it can take credit for instilling a flurry of buzzwords into the national psyche that changed the term of the economic debate, right? The 1% and all this. Of course, it just means oligarchy, and oligarchy is a better way to say it than 1%, because it's qualitative as well as quantitative. Indeed, the very way in which many Americans think about how wealth and political power coalesces has been altered by the concept of the 1%. So fine. So you've introduced a new word, right? You can do that with a Twitter. You can do that with a YouTube. You can introduce, one YouTube film gets macaca all over the place, right? Sinking this racist, mediocre nepotist, George Allen, right? He's there because of his father was a coach for the Washington Redskins. All right, now let's continue. Cynically, the national Occupy movement might be seen as another pseudo-rebellious lifestyle for young adults who aren't cut out for the rat race, like obsessive tattooing or following fish. Well, you may have a point. Now, a year on, OWS's imprint seems lightest where it is needed most, near the financial centers of power. And he says you can find Occupy in Ithaca, New York, Cornell, but you can't find it anywhere near Wall Street. And we'll be back in just a minute with some more analysis on this. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Keep up with everything at Tarpley.net, Tarpley.net, Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. It was on Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed that we first put out the word that the Anti-Austerity United Front, the No Cuts United Front, will launch in New York City on October 27th, Saturday, October 27th, from noon to 6 p.m. at 56 Walker Street, and that will be in Tribeca. More details as time goes by. A website will go up, and other than that, don't ask me because it's all in flux. Pantare, everything is changing from hour to hour. It's an organizing conference. It's not a bunch of academic set-piece presentations. Accent on political discussion, political debate, and action proposals. It's for action in terms of program, organization, leadership, and a strategy, aiming initially to create a united front, similar to Syriza, right? Syriza, I think you can argue persuasively, this is the best proximate model we have of something that might work. Greece is not the U.S., but this has worked this year. Don't follow the Indignados. They failed. The Indignados got nowhere. Don't follow failed examples. Try to find one that succeeded. Syriza did, from 4% to 27%. They are now the opposition. They are in a position to take power under certain circumstances. That's where we want to be. So protest is not the idea. We don't have time for mere protest anymore. Mere protest is for wimps. Revolutionaries are into seizing power, or at least part of power. Remember, the Tea Party got 75 to 80 members of Congress, 6 senators, and the Occupy Wall Street, as this article is telling us, got absolutely nothing. And why? Because of anarchist ideas spread by these creeps at Adbusters, the anthropologist David Graeber, and other examples of misleaders. Just to go back to this interesting article here in Our Town, a year later, Occupy Wall Street has its imprint lightest where it is needed most, near the financial centers of power. You can find it in Ithaca near Cornell, but you can't find it in Manhattan. Worst of all, perhaps, despite its exciting rhetoric of economic equality, Occupy's influence during a decisive election, when real issues determining the well-being of the majority of Americans are in play, their influence seems to be non-existent. Non-existent. Some of this absence of muscle flexing during the election may be attributed to choice. Yeah, choice, because the leaders are wreckers. Journalist and activist Chris Hedges may be the closest the movement has to an intellectual mouthpiece. Well, that's why you're in trouble. As I had occasion to explain to this gathering of, 50 or 60 people there in the St. Mark's Place Theater, if your intellectual leadership is Noam Chomsky and Chris Hedges, and your media arm is Amy Goodman of Democracy Now!, and your organizational dimension is Occupy Wall Street, you're in big trouble. You're doomed. You will be defeated. You are gone, finished, kaput. It's just a question until they come to round you up. And, of course, in this case, it happened. So, very, very interesting article there. We've also got another one called Metro New York, #1 free daily in the city. This is now more pro-Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street aims at comeback. And here's what they want to do, as we read in this article. As in the past, one of their key plans is to try to disrupt the morning commute into the financial district. Isn't that great? The guy out in Illinois or Michigan or Wisconsin who's facing foreclosure will be so happy to know that the executives at Bank of America had to take an extra 10 minutes on their commute. That's really going to mean a lot to him to know that, right? That's going to be a deep emotional satisfaction. And then, of course, we read on further in the article. Earlier in the month, protesters they talked about making citizens' arrests of bankers as they go to work this morning, but it's unclear if they'll go ahead with that plan. The same thing. Oh, my God. What stupidity. What impotence. What abject imbecility. And that's what it's come to. Well, that's anarchism, right? That's what anarchists do. They always have. We're not surprised. All right. But what we now have to think about is what to do about this. In other words, as I'm just trying to explain, with the collapse of the Ron Paul libertarian sideshow or clown show on the far right, because this was extreme reactionary, festooned with fascist economic demands. And, of course, Ron Paul, total union busting. Rand Paul, total union busting. Romney, total union busting. The Republican lockstep, bust all unions, make every state a right-to-work state. That's a disaster. Let's destroy the only mass institutions that could ever fight totalitarianism and call that liberty and freedom. Is this insanity, or is it that they're agents of Wall Street? Only their hairdresser knows for sure. So Ron Paul clown show collapsed, and Occupy Wall Street collapsed, and an object of mockery in its own way, right? Look at that Bill Maher thing about how kids want to camp in the park, but working people, the real blue-collar universe, they don't have time for this. They don't have time to savor the ineffable comic dimensions of culture jamming and détournement. So that's the moment, right? There is this space. Let's move into that space. Let's reassemble people that have been disoriented by these two phenomena, also by Obama, right? Some people had been pulled astray by Obama and by other things, right? We also have to stress trade union struggles by themselves will not work. Let's just take a look at Chicago. Now, we support the Chicago teachers' strike, right? We think this is absolutely essential. They're fighting this group of so-called educational reformers who are really union busters. They're fighting Rahm Emanuel, who is like a tin pot dictator. He thinks he's the Netanyahu of Chicago, and he can dictate to people and use threats and gangster tactics. And now the Chicago teacher strike has ended, and some say it's a draw. Here's the thing. If you are a public sector union, you are doomed if you don't raise the issue of the Wall Street sales tax. You must. It's a precondition for survival. You need the Wall Street sales tax like you need air to breathe. You go into a strike like this and you say, we want a wage increase and we want to increase various facilities for the kids in the classroom. We want to have hirings. We want to, develop the system rather than wrecking it. Well, where's the money going to come from? And the usual trade union answer to that is, well, that's not our affair. Let the government figure that out. No, that will not cut the mustard, because the average person then thinks, oh my God, they're going to tax me to pay more, and I'm sympathetic, but I can't pay more. You've got to specify who will pay. The existential question of the age. There's a depression. It's a world economic depression of unbelievable proportions, of awesome genocidal power. Who's going to pay for getting rid of that depression? Is it going to be the Wall Street zombie bankers and hedge fund hyenas, the vulture capitalists, private equity, LBO, leveraged buyout operatives like Romney? Or is it going to be working people? We know what Wall Street says, and Obama says too, and Romney. It's going to be working people paying most of that bill. No. And we don't want any regressive taxation either. So if you don't want to fall prey to that, the answer is you've got to specify a 1% Wall Street sales tax across the board on all financial transactions where property changes hands. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Texas Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So let the word go forth. The Anti-Austerity United Front will convene New York City, October 27th, noon to 6, 56 Walker Street, down there in Tribeca, right below Canal Street, various, Canal Street subway stops nearby. More details will come. Don't email me for details. They will go up on a dedicated website, and don't ask me when, because that's being done by others, but you get the idea. This is all improvised. This is all on the fly. So exercise your own initiative and your own energy to bring this about, rather than thinking that you can wait for others to do it. Right? At that rate, nothing will get done. So the Chicago teachers, they might have gotten a draw. I think it's really not a good result at all. But above all, compared to what could have been. If they had been out there hitting hard with the Wall Street sales tax, and remember, the derivatives markets of the world are in Chicago, right? The Chicago Board Options Exchange, the Chicago Board of Trade, the Chicago Merc. That's where the derivatives are traded. Futures and options are in Chicago. Slap a 1% Wall Street sales tax on those transactions, and you've got enough to pay for a decent school system. You've got enough to pay for some breakfasts and lunches, because as we read here in the interesting article by Harold Meyerson in the Washington Post of today, right, of Friday, September 21st, you've got to remember that in Chicago, 87% of students come from households below the poverty threshold. So you've got almost 90%, 9/10 of the kids are coming from poverty backgrounds. And then you're going to blame the teachers for that. See, the trick here is you see that society is collapsing, and you see that this is expressed in a particularly dramatic way in the schools. So along comes Bill Gates and Eli Brood, and they say, well, we'll use that for union busting purposes, and we'll blame that all on the teachers. Why don't you blame it on the failure of the job creators to create 30 million jobs? In other words, the ridiculous incompetence of the U.S. ruling class. So out there in Chicago, they had some support, right? The only groups, we're reading Meyerson now, the only groups that opposed the strike, narrowly, were the parents of children in private schools and whites. Blacks and Latinos overwhelmingly supported the strike. Teaching in major cities, Chicago is a very good example. Teaching is a profession in which minorities are heavily represented. When reformers means Bill Gates, the union buster, when they argue we need to take down the teachers' unions to give more opportunity to minority youth, the argument becomes, quote, we need to destroy the black middle class in order to save it. In other words, we destroy the black teachers in order to save the black kids. This is absolutely ridiculous, and it's the goal of all this is to destroy the system of free, universal, compulsory, quality public education that we've tried to have in the United States since the days of Horace Mann back in Massachusetts, right, when there was some progress going on. So we deeply sympathize with the Chicago teachers, but again, you need the Wall Street sales tax. Without this, you're fighting with one arm behind your back. I say, hey, Randy Weingarten, why didn't you make that the leading edge, the spear point of your agitation? Look, the National Nurses United are demanding it. Now, unfortunately, they call it a Robin Hood tax. Get rid of this Robin Hood tax. This is, British anarchists. This is crazy stuff. Nobody wants this. It's not serious. It's called a Wall Street sales tax. Most people, when they hear Robin Hood tax, they think that they're going to be looted for somebody who's more destitute than they are. Never forget this. So call it what it is. It's a sales tax on speculators. It's a sales tax on Wall Street. This is the key to any struggle in the public sector. If you don't have the Wall Street sales tax, you are increasingly doomed. And I urge you, take this up. And if the National Nurses United can do it, why can't you do it? What's wrong? What's missing? Wake up. And let me also specify, it's not a wealth tax. No, not a wealth tax. We have the neo-Trotskyists are out there. They want a wealth tax. In other words, instead of having an income tax, they want a wealth tax. They used to have this in Germany, Vermögensteuer, right? Wealth tax. And then you have to basically put down everything you own, and they tax you a percentage of your net worth. This is a bad idea because, again, many people think that this will target them. This will be a gift to Republican demagogues. This will be a wonderful Christmas present to reactionaries, right? I can see the Koch brothers rubbing their hands in glee if the demand turns out to be a wealth tax. You don't want to make it a wealth tax for all of these reasons, mainly psychological, right? That many people think that it's going to target them. The other dimension is the power to tax is the power to destroy. The power to tax is the power to dissuade, right? To move you away from something. And you don't want to do that with wealth necessarily. You want to do it with speculation. Speculation is the one thing anybody who is not insane can say isn't evil, that the world has got too much speculation, too much casino economy, and so forth going on. So make it a tax on speculation. And again, it's a 1% tax. I've got somebody telling me that Paul Krugman or somebody wants a 1%, a 1 cent tax on derivatives. No, 1%. And I'm a moderate here. I'm not saying let all financial transactions be taxed at the going rate of the state sales tax, like in California, right? 12% in many areas. Let the financiers pay that. No, I'm trying to be moderate. 1%. Now, of course, you may want to start out with the 12%, and then at the other end you'll have 1% left. But you get the idea. And of course, it comes equipped with a $1 million per person exclusion, so that individuals who feel that they want to trade for their IRAs or their 401ks or their retirement or whatever it is, their family property, that's fine. We're not going to take that away from you. You get a $1 million trading exemption per person per year. So if it's a family, right, husband, wife, each one gets $1 million excluded. So a tax on speculation. And don't make it a wealth tax. The other problem with the wealth tax is there's not enough wealth. The amount of money that goes through those Chicago options markets is in the quadrillions. It's 3, 4, 5 quadrillion per year. And of course, it is clear that if you put a 1% tax on that, those volumes will go down drastically to something more normal. But even then, there will be a continuous trading, and that then can be used. So the ideal model is a 1% Wall Street sales tax, half of it for the feds, half of it for the state in question. All right. So this is a good example. You want to find programmatic elements that grow organically out of the struggles, or that are objectively suggested or demanded. The Chicago teacher strike cries out for the Wall Street, or in this case, Chicago Board Options Exchange, Chicago Merck, and Chicago Board of Trade derivatives tax, right? Because that's what this would be. It's not just Wall Street; it's Chicago, and in some ways, there's more money in Chicago than there is in Wall Street. But most people don't know this, so you get the idea. Now, here's the other thing: you got to distinguish between agitation and propaganda. Agitation is something you're actually trying to do right now. Propaganda is more a matter of somewhat longer-term education and so forth. So we got to talk about what kinds of demands are up front. In other words, your public projection of who you are and what you're demanding to do. This has to be addressed. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. The convention, the founding convention, if you will, of the National Anti-Austerity Committee's Anti-Austerity United Front, set now for October 27th, New York City, from noon to 6. 56 Walker Street, Tribeca, below Canal Street. Details will follow. Patience and the relevant website will go up. This is an organizing conference. It aims at actual debate, back and forth, discussion, participation in the plenum, not workshops, not long academic speeches, but action and the details of practice, what's going to be done. The goal is to come out of it with a strategy and a commitment to organize for the united front on the part of these groups, right? If Alexis Tsipras was able to weld together 12 different sects, parties, splinter groups, splinter parties, whatever they were, to make a united force that could go from 4% to 27%. Isn't it time to try that here and to somehow go beyond whatever one's particular parochial set of demands might be, and realize that no demands are going to go through without the mass movement and without the affirmation of the united front? I mean, that's what you see with Syriza. Now, just we know essentially the 5 categories, right? Listeners know. The first one, the cutting edge and the way that you make your name in public and the way people will know you and understand you is stop austerity, no cuts, roll back austerity cuts, hands off the economic rights of the American people, no grand bargain. Don't you dare touch Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, unemployment benefits, Head Start, WIC, child nutrition. You know the drill. The second one, of course, is we've got to act to reduce the power of the zombie bankers, and from an economic point of view, to destroy, to remove the fictitious capital that they attempt to affirm, which is crushing production, consumption, and preventing economic recovery. And it's things like the Wall Street sales tax against speculation, the way that more new speculative, fictitious capital is generated. Put an end to too big to fail. Enforce the laws against the zombie banks. They're bankrupt, they go into liquidation. They're violating antitrust laws, get rid of them. It's a big order, but it's the only road. End too big to fail. You get 90% of the American people on your side. Put an end to too big to fail. Too big to fail is illegal. It means violating existing law. It's an impossible. You can't call that prosecutorial discretion. It's a blatant attempt to ignore the law. Go on then to ban the worst derivatives. Ban credit default swaps. Ban collateralized debt obligations. Tax all the other kinds 1%. You get the idea. That's the second point. To attack and destroy fictitious capital, this burden in derivatives in particular that's crushing the world. Third point, seize the Fed, nationalize the Fed, federalize the Fed. Don't abolish it. That means to abolish the Fed means let's deregulate Wall Street even more. No. And we want 0% credit, but not for zombie bankers, hedge fund hyenas, money market mutual funds. 0% credit for production. You hear it now on certain oil companies are putting ads on there. Infrastructure, manufacturing, cement, pipes, making things. Yes, that's it. From Silicon Valley and the electricity grids all the way down to the local dry cleaner and restaurant. If there's a tangible physical product involved, 0% or as close to it as you can get. If you're a little bit shaky, maybe it's a little bit more, but essentially 0% across the board. Century bonds for the infrastructure. Put out a tender offer to the states for century bonds, 100-year bonds, 0% coupon, and that gets us to point 4, the rebuilding of all infrastructure. And remember, it means ports, the rebuilding of modern world-class seaports. We really don't have any. The highway system, rebuild the entire interstate highway system, rebuild the entire system of electricity and energy distribution, the rail system, be it passenger, commuter, or freight, public housing. We're told that the crisis in schools, right? Kids have to have lunch at 10 o'clock in the morning because their school is so crowded. Start building schools. Start building 1,000 modern hospitals and take it from there across the board, right? People know this stuff. We got to rebuild those railway tunnels in New York and Baltimore and all over the place. We've got to raise the roads along the Gulf Coast and all the other infrastructure things that we've talked about here over the past weeks. And that's point 4. 30 million jobs is the goal under point 4. Well-paid union wages. Davis-Bacon Act will apply. And 5, the new Bretton Woods. Now, new Bretton Woods is a great thing, but it's a propaganda demand at this point. You can do that when you've already taken over the government. Let me also point out, we're not interested in process demands. This is petty bourgeois stuff. We're not interested in good government or process reforms. We don't care at the moment about campaign finance reform. That has no mass traction except among petty bourgeois people who are incapable of being organized. We want mass traction. In other words, the demands you need must address the survival needs of working people. The survival needs, the kitchen table, life or death interests. Can you stay in your house? Can you afford the next meal? Can you avoid foreclosure? Can you get medical care? Can you pay a tuition bill? And so forth. Mass traction demand. And these, from the point of view of economics, these are more than legitimate. These are sacrosanct. Because what you're talking about is preserving your workforce, defending your human capital while the recovery begins and gathers strength. But you've got to save people. They need dinner tonight. They need to see the doctor today. They need to stay in their house and ward off the zombie banker with a foreclosure order from a robo-signer, a robo-judge in a robo-court. So we need to think about demands like this. Let me just say, first of all, not Glass-Steagall. Not Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall fetishism is pathetic. We'll get to the roots of this in just a minute. What does that mean to the average person, Glass-Steagall? We're going to divide investment banks from savings banks. It's a great idea. I'm all for it. But that's not your mass edge. That's not where you start. You've got to start with something like this. Medicare for all. Medicare for all. $100 per person per month, and if you're destitute, it's for free. $100 if you can afford it, and for free if you can't. But Medicare for all. How about number 2? Got problems with foreclosures? How about the Fraser-Lemke Act? Stop foreclosures. Stop them. 5 years or the duration of the Depression. If you can get any judge at any level to approve a payment plan, you stay in your home. Fraser-Lemke Act. Third, no layoffs, especially no government layoffs. No government layoffs. And it means we've got to use the revenue. Now you'll say, how are you going to pay for that? Use the revenue from the Wall Street sales tax for revenue sharing, right? That's the idea. Half of it goes to the feds, half of it goes to the states. No layoffs of public employees, teachers, cops, nurses in the public hospitals, and all the rest of it, right? Firemen. And student loan amnesty. Freeze it. 5 years or the duration of the Depression. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Rushing along, we're talking about what kinds of demands would be the leading edge of an anti-austerity coalition, an anti-austerity united front of the type that we hope will emerge in New York City, October 27th at 56 Walker Street from noon to 6. That's the founding convention. And, of course, organizations, representatives are particularly welcome. Individuals also, famous intellectuals, needless to say, but task-oriented. And this is not, if Michael Moore wants to come for self-promotion, I'm afraid we're going to have to limit that. And it's got to be goal-oriented because genocide threatens. So not Glass-Steagall, not campaign finance reform, petty bourgeois good government demands, not increasing the oversight budget of the SEC. These are all fine things, but that can't be the mass traction. That's not your leading edge of agitation. Those are, things that will take care of themselves once you get a few people into the Congress and you've seized some power. But right now, a student loan amnesty. The zombie banks who were bailed out by the American people will say thank you by allowing, by being imposed on with a student loan amnesty, the total freeze of all interest and principal on the $1 trillion of student loans that are now crushing the younger generation. Student loan amnesty. Zombie banks say, thank you, American people, for saving us. And then they go into bankruptcy liquidation anyway. In order to keep civilization going, you have to have education. A lot of this stuff has to be now, right? Dinner has to be tonight, and the class has to be tomorrow at the latest. We've got to find a way to make state colleges, state institutions, and community colleges essentially free if you need it. In other words, to use flows of tax money out of the Wall Street sales tax to pay for education, because this is the one thing we've got to keep going. The goal, again, to preserve the quality of your labor force. You've got to do it. The 99ers. Oh, I remember Ed Schultz on MSNBC. He was going to fight for the 99ers, come what may. In other words, if you've gotten over 99 weeks, or in many states, of course, now it's much less, thanks to Obama's sellouts, right? The Satan sandwich and the spring 2011 sellouts by Obama, those have cut the number of weeks you're going to get on unemployment benefits in most places. What we've got to do with that is make unemployment benefits open-ended. we've got to essentially get the 99ers back on their benefits. They need their checks. They can't. They're going to be homeless. They're going to die from lack of medical care and so forth. So, unemployment benefits are open-ended. There is no time limit, at least as long as this depression is lashing the world. People who have been fired, right? State government workers, teachers, firemen, policemen, bureaucrats, got to be rehired, right? People who work at the DMV, whatever it is. And we want to roll back anti-worker, anti-union measures like the fascist Walker in Wisconsin, the fascist Mitch Daniels in Indiana, and so on down the line. Right? Stop all of that. I'm also looking at the Social Security Act of 1935, the provision aid to mothers with dependent children, so-called welfare. The problem we have is the 50 million, right? We have 50 million Americans who are destitute. They're in severe poverty. They're living on food stamps only. And we've got to do something. We've got to reach in there and do something for mothers with dependent children. I say consider now the restoration of the old welfare system, at least for the duration of the Depression. Because one of the reasons we have 50 million people in abject poverty is because there is no more welfare. And it has not been a success. It's been a failure. And I'm sorry about Bill Clinton and his wonderful speech at the Democratic Convention, but it's a failure. We also would be well advised to impose a national usury law, something like 5% is the most interest you can legally charge anywhere in the United States. And if you do more, it's a federal crime. Got to do something about payday lenders, loan sharks, and things like this that are preying on desperate people. So you get the idea. Now, all of that has to be on budget, just about all of it. We'll talk in coming times about how you seize the Fed. The Fed has got to be seized because that's how you're going to finance the recovery. Krugman is wrong. With all the demands that already exist on the federal budget, the things that I've just said, all of your mass traction defense of the workforce demands, those are on budget. They have to be. In addition to that, though, you need a capital budget, right? The capital budget is your massive infrastructure, the program that I talked about before. That's got to come out of the Fed. The Fed is going to cough up 0% century bonds through a Main Street window or a state infrastructure window. Now, let's change gears. We don't want to forget about Bishop Romney. Now, this is a lead-in to the fact that my study on this subject, Bishop Romney's Tradition, and it's subtitled Polygamy, Theocracy, Anti-Americanism, and the Mormon Party. Bishop Romney's Tradition. This will be ready, I suppose the technical date will be something like October 1st, but the actual books, I think, will be available before that. And we'll talk more about that in the coming weeks, as we have been talking about it. But go to Tarpley.net in the coming week. I know I said this before, but this time the book is really there. Go to Tarpley.net and go to ProgressivePress.com. Progressive Press of California will also have a button up so you can start ordering this book. Now, the relevance of it is, I think, very obvious. This past week, we've had Romney, Bishop Romney, of course, because he's a bishop. Bishop Romney talked to this group of fat cats. This is Mark Lader, a hedge fund hyena in Boca Raton, Florida. He's a private equity manager, right? It means leveraged buyouts, asset stripping, junk bonds, and all the rest of it. Boca Raton, Florida. So Romney, of course, now notoriously says there are 47% of the people who will vote for the president no matter what. There are 47% who are with him, who are dependent upon government. They believe that they are victims, who believe the government has a responsibility to care for them, who believe that they are entitled to health care, to food, to housing, to you name it. That's an entitlement, and the government should give it to them, and they will vote for this president no matter what. These are people who pay no income tax. My job is not to worry about these people. I'll never convince them. They should take personal responsibility and care for their lives. Now, this is a declaration of class war and class-based genocide. and it shows what the ruling class thinks. If you're a hedge fund hyena, like this guy, or a zombie banker, or a corporate raider, or a vulture capitalist, you're a parasite, and this is what you tell yourself, that this is why you're where you are, and they're where they are. So we've got to organize, and I'll comment about this and the relevance of this to Bishop Romney's tradition. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, Bishop Romney's tradition. Take a look at Tarpley.net, Progressive Press of California, progressivepress.com. Don't forget, October 27th, New York City, founding convention of the National Anti-Austerity United Front, or Anti-Austerity Coalition. 56 Walker Street website will go up. Details will follow as they are determined. Most of them are in flux at this time. Anyway, Romney made this tirade, right? Declaration of class war with genocidal intent against, he says, only about half of the American people, but it's more. The best answer to this, the best response, E.J. Dionne of the Washington Post. Thursday, September 20th, we read a column, At Odds with America. Let's just see what old E.J. has to say. The most incisive reaction to Mitt Romney's disparaging comments about 47% of us came from a conservative friend who emailed, quote, and pay attention, if I were you, I'd wonder why Romney hates America so much. Close quote. Obviously a reactionary friend of E.J. Dionne. He wants to know, if I were you, I'd wonder why Romney hates America so much. And E.J. says, a bit strong perhaps, but the more you think about what Romney said, the more you wonder how he really feels about the country he wants to lead. Yes, I have the answer. I'll tell you why he hates the United States. It is the Mormon tradition. Very little known, as Sidney Hershon of Queens College said, Mormon history is almost completely ignored in evaluating what's going on with it today. And the tradition, of course, is the resentment rooted in the idea that the American people did not accept Joseph Smith as their savior, did not bow down to worship Joseph Smith. When Joseph Smith said, Joseph Smith or the sword, and otherwise he's going to transform the whole country from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast into one lake of blood and gore, that would have been the time to bow down and worship Joseph Smith. And the American people didn't do that, and not only that, a mob appeared that killed Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith. And this is the central event of world history. For the Mormon, that's the central event of world history, and that's what has to be avenged, because Brigham Young then added the doctrine of blood atonement. In other words, the individual killers of Joseph Smith have gone to their reward. They may have repented, and according to Christianity, they may have gone into everlasting glory, but not from the Mormon point of view. That's basically deicide, right? You've gone way too far, and the only way to make up for that is to be killed yourself in blood. So that's the resentment, and it's expressed in the Mormon Oath of Vengeance. I wonder, E.J. Dionne, have you ever heard of the Mormon Oath of Vengeance that was recited in the temple liturgy, the so-called endowment, every time they had a ceremony until 1927, and it binds everybody for 4 generations, and that includes George Romney, governor of Michigan, and his son Mitt, and Tag's children too. They're all going to avenge Joseph and Hiram Smith on the United States. The tradition of Bishop Romney is a resentment against America. It also includes specific hostility. First of all, polygamy. What is polygamy? Polygamy is a hostility to women and their rights. Then we have hostility to people who happen to have a black or brown skin. The Book of Mormon, the Book of Abraham, say, wow, those are the Ham, descendants of Ham, and the Lamanites, and they're inferior. Romney also, contempt for Latinos and Hispanics, right? They should prepare to self-deport. Concerning workers, right? Well, Bain Capital basically says we're going to rip you off. We're going to asset strip your company and shut it down, and or send it all off to China or some other runaway shop. We can go on, right? The White Horse prophecy means you got to hate Russia, and he has expressed that. He may have other grudges that we don't know about, and there are, you can look in the paper every day. There's some new group that he's got an axe to grind with. The Mormon Church has been a reactionary political force in American history. We have Ezra Taft Benson, who was the prophet. He was the head of the whole thing, saying that Dr. Martin Luther King was a communist agitator and the civil rights movement was communist agitation. The other thing we find in the 1930s is an eagerness to please Nazi Germany. And let's just talk a little bit about this. George Romney, the father of the current candidate. We're told by Dinesh D'Souza that it's fine to go and look at Barack Obama Sr. because he's an anti-imperialist, and that's where Obama gets his anti-American agenda. Well, I've been through all that. Some of it's true up to a point, but I think after 4 years in office, some of this stuff has been blotted out by hard experience. But let's look at George Romney, right? So he comes back from Mexico. He's the guy who says that the Mexican Revolution was motivated by envy against people like himself, because they were successful and the others weren't, and the Mexicans wanted to steal their property and then build a paradise with stolen property. So he doesn't. That's his understanding of the Mexican Revolution, a big thing, right? Demands for land reform, other kinds of reforms brought in, but no, not from Romney's point of view. So the question now becomes George Romney, right? So this is George, the father of the current one. So his background is what? First of all, he's telling you Pancho Villa is the politics of envy. That's all he can see. It's interesting. We have Park Romney. Park Romney is a fairly young guy. I mean, not too old anyway, an adult, but there. Park Romney says the Mormon Church is an American cult. And this is Romney's cousin, removed once or twice. When George Romney, the father, went to work, who did he go to work for? Alcoa, the Aluminum Corporation of America. It happens that this is part of a Nazi-centered cartel system. Let's quote from George Seldes in his book, 1,000 Americans and also Facts and Fascism. Quote, by its cartel agreement with IG Farben, controlled by Hitler, Alcoa sabotaged the aluminum program of the United States Air Force. And the sabotage turned out to be almost 40% of a year's production, 1,000 fighter planes or 1,665 bombers that were not built in the war mobilization because of Alcoa catering to their cartel agreements with IG Farben. Harold Ickes, June 26, 1941. If America loses the war, it can thank Aluminum Corporation of America. And that's who George Romney is working for. Then he goes to work for GM and Ford. You know this stuff. Henry Ford, anti-Semite. He has Ford Werke in Cologne, Nazi war economy. He's supposed to build the Willow Run bomber plant, but he doesn't get it off the ground for 2 years. He hired Charles Lindbergh, the Nazi simp, to be one of his employees. General Motors, of course, controlled by DuPont. DuPont had cartel agreements with IG Farben and so forth. You get the idea. And then when George Romney runs for office, it's on the basis of this pro-Nazi moral rearmament of Frank Buchman. More about this next week, but we'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Got to rush to get some stuff here in the last segment. Remember, the film, right? The anti-Islamic film is important. Don't say this has played no role. The Republicans don't want that film to be important because it leads right to them. The Romney campaign made that film. We go from the Coptic activist Nasrallah to the Islamophobia network associated with Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer, I think his name is. Key member of that, dominant figure, most famous person in that group, John Bolton, future Secretary of State for Romney, top pro-Romney neocon. So don't let go of the film. The film is key. The Romney campaign made the film. Then the death of Ambassador Stevens. Who could have killed him? We see all sorts of people. Well, since we're about to talk about LaRouche, right? LaRouche blames Obama. Sorry, Kumu was in Guantanamo Bay. How do you get out of Guantanamo Bay? You make a deal with the CIA to do whatever they want. Kumu was then shipped back to Libya, part of the attack on Gaddafi, and now he comes and kills Ambassador Stevens. That's a CIA asset killing a State Department ambassador, and I'm sorry for those who think that they can somehow blame that on Obama, right? You can hang Obama for what he's actually done. You don't need to try to get him for things that have been done by others. But now, on this interesting topic, we have to pay attention to various groups that are flanking operations for Romney, right? We paid attention to Ron Paul. We got to pay attention now to this LaRouche youth movement, which is flanking operation for Romney in the sense that they're out there vilifying Obama like mad, blaming, he's the new Hitler, he's all this stuff. But they're essentially an arm of the Romney campaign. Now, a group of these people in the LaRouche youth movement have now left this organization. It looks like the breakup of the LaRouche youth movement. Some 8 members, of which the best known is a guy called Sky Shields, have left. So if there's a 75-page document where they describe what happened to them, you can find this on the internet. Look up Sky Shields in quotes and why we left. The problem with this document is it's focused on the little world of what's going on with, the dementia of LaRouche or other similar issues, but not enough on the political framework. Maybe once or twice in the entire document, they seem to realize that they're in effect an auxiliary of the Romney campaign, but that's really just one sentence towards the end. When you see LaRouche coming out saying the attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi is to be blamed on Obama, not the CIA. This is what he always does. Never the CIA. Don't mention the CIA. You will have seen me on Press TV a little while ago with a representative of this entity, and it's really interesting that there's almost a taboo on any reference to the CIA, and that's because what is being purveyed here is CIA disinformation. And let's give some interesting examples. In 2007, 2008, if you went to LaRouche and that group and asked what's the main deployment of the ruling class for the 2008 election, they told you Bloomberg, Mayor Bloomberg of New York City, is the main fascist danger in the United States. Now, I have to say that's very much like calculated disinformation, because anybody who knew would know that the Obama campaign was building up behind the scenes and that this Bloomberg was going nowhere. So they don't do anything to prevent Obama from becoming president, but then once he is president in March 2009, they discover, when it's too late to affect the outcome, that he's the new Nero, the new Hitler, and everything that you've seen. Later on, in 2011, we come to the crisis in Libya, and you will notice, you can still find this on the internet, that LaRouche's line on Libya was down with Gaddafi duck, and this meant taking a genocidal NATO bombing campaign and supporting it under the cover of a joke. And generally speaking, you can find the cartoon. This Gaddafi duck, I would say to the people in the LaRouche youth movement, if that would have been the time to exit, when you start supporting imperialist bombing of Libya under the slogan Gaddafi Duck. That's time to clear out. The Arab Spring, of course, very embarrassing for LaRouche because he doesn't know what to say about it. So basically, for months and months, he said nothing, even though he had people in his conferences coming forward and asking what's going on. But the idea is that this is refined, high-level disinformation that's being offered. A couple of other examples. In 2010, we had the tsunami and the Fukushima nuclear plant disaster. Now, out there in the world, and I can't judge whether this is true or not, although it's plausible, there was a general idea that the HAARP, that basically the CIA acting through HAARP, H-A-A-R-P, had generated the tidal wave and the crisis there at Fukushima. And the idea was that Japan was preparing to break with the United States and enter into an alliance with China. Again, I don't know whether that's true or not, but the fact, undisputable fact, is that out there in the world, there was a growing body of public opinion that wanted to blame the CIA. At that point, you will have noticed, LaRouche comes out and says, it's all coming from the Crab Nebula. It's coming from 575 million light years away, or whatever it is, right? It blamed the Crab Nebula, not the CIA. Let's see what else we have. Let's look at France. 2003. France, Dominique de Villepin and Chirac, to some extent, are leading the resistance against Mad Dog Bush, Cheney, and the neocons on the Iraq War and the general insanity of those days. What does LaRouche do? He comes up with the idea that the real force of evil in the world is not the Anglo-Americans, not the neocons, not anything like that, but it's the synarchists, la synarchie, the French Freemasons, the Martinistes, right? The Martinist Freemasons, the followers of Joseph de Maistre and Dominique de Villepin, and so forth. So you see what it is. It's to provide targeted disinformation, and I have it from a very well-placed observer of all this, that the ability of LaRouche to dupe people out in the world is still there. Some other examples. Putin, in the fall of 2011, when it became likely that Putin was going to come back to power in Russia, to the presidency, it's obvious, right? The news today is that Putin is kicking out USAID. He's trying to cut the ability of the U.S. to meddle, interfere, outrageously try to affect the internal politics of Russia. Well, instead of facing that reality, what you heard from LaRouche was, there's going to be a Pacific alliance of the U.S., China, and Russia, and maybe Japan, not Europe, but it's going to be a Pacific alliance, and that Putin's program is to have an alliance with the U.S. Not exactly what happened, was it? And you can see it's so crazy that it can hardly not be intentional. And what else do we have? Supporting John Kerry in 2004. I can remember in 2005, people from this entity that we're talking about, one of them came and said, the gang of 12 U.S. senators with Warner and Byrd is going to be the solution of the world's problems. What did they bring us? They brought us Alito, Thomas, and the reactionary Supreme Court majority we have. We were also told in 2005 that the Democratic Party has gone back to its New Deal roots. So I think it would be important for people who have come out of this to realize that what was being offered was obviously not reliable, and I think we can see fairly easily why it was not reliable. But it implies a very high level of intelligence awareness to realize how these particular lines are supposed to affect the outcome in the world. So remember, October 27th, save the date, October 27th, New York City, and Bishop Romney's tradition from Tarpley.net, from Progressive Press of California, and we'll see you all next week. In front. The name is still a work in progress. This will have a launch, an initial meeting, a preliminary convention, which is going to be held in New York City. Mark your calendars and save the date. It will be New York City, October 27th, about 5 weeks away. October 27th in New York City. The area is Tribeca, Canal Street, just below Canal Street. 56 Walker Street will be the premises. This will be an organizing conference. This will not be a bunch of droning speakers. This is for political discussion, to actually hammer out a program of struggle, not information, but a way to mobilize and a way to intervene, in particular, since the election is a lost cause, or at least it's largely a lost cause, to intervene in the anti-austerity struggles that we're going to need during the lame duck session. We know that Obama has already said he's eager to sell you out with a grand bargain with reactionary and proto-fascist Republicans. Appeasement, unbelievable. But he's running on that. He said so in his convention speech. Eager for a grand bargain. And what it's going to mean is some tiny, tiny symbolic tax on oligarchs, right? A 1% increase on some tax that oligarchs pay. And in exchange for that, massive rape of the middle class and complete destruction, at least beginning of the complete destruction, of your economic rights, your Medicare, your Medicaid, your unemployment benefits, your minimum wage, your Social Security, your Pell Grants, and everything with it, your Head Start, your WIC, and so forth. That's what it's going to be. That's the grand bargain. A little bit of a tax cut on the super rich to provide some political cover for the demagogue Obama, and then massive cuts for the middle class, and yet another attack on the New Deal, the New Frontier, and the Great Society. So this is an organizing conference. It is not there to impart information. I shudder when I hear people say, thanks for the information. The problem with information is there's too much of it. We need concepts, and above all, you've got to come out of it with a concept of how to organize and a commitment to do it, to build the united front. This is going to be, if it works, it's going to be a united front of various organizations. Some are unions, some are political organizations, some are the shards left over from Occupy, other kinds of groups, community groups, individuals. We may even have some drifting politicians from the existing parties. They can be in, but not the Democratic Party and not the Republican Party. They're not welcome. But people who break off from them, obviously, have got to be part of the picture. So mark your calendar. All of the details are in flux, so don't send me a bunch of emails demanding total details. There will be a website for this soon. When? Soon. This is not what I'm doing. Others are doing it. I can't control it. I can't predict it. But they'll be, and I don't even know the name of it. It'll be something like New Deal Coalition or Against Austerity or Anti-Austerity. There's, of course, even a problem with the name austerity, since most people don't know what austerity means, right? Part of this is no cuts. But this is not just economic program. Economic program is, of course, the centerpiece. But you know what we need if you've been listening, right? The economic program alone is not sufficient. You've also got to have organization, leadership, and a strategy. And all those things that the anarchists at Occupy Wall Street told you that you can't have and that you shouldn't even want to have. So that's what we'll be doing. Talk about this more later in the program, because then we have something else that we've got to get to right away. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So we're celebrating September 22nd, the pre-Emancipation Proclamation, the beginning of the... That was the answer, to create a prosperous class of small farmers. and to extend the Homestead Act from the public lands of the Midwest, extend that into these slave plantations, break them up. This was attempted by Thaddeus Stevens, the guiding light of Gettysburg College here up the road, right? One of the radical Republicans. He's vilified as being vindictive. The breakup of these plantations of the Confederate leaders and the creation of a class of small farmers among the freed former slaves, that would have been the answer to break the backwardness of the Southern system, which is otherwise with us still today. So we've heard the slogan, the answer to 1984 is 1776. Partly true, but 1776 by itself is not enough, as the Civil War shows beyond any argument. There was something missing in the 1776 and the 1788 Constitution, something more, and that had to be the prohibition of slavery and the 14th Amendment that the slavocrats and their libertarians today, the leprechaun Ron Paul, want to abolish the 14th Amendment because it prevents states from depriving people of life, liberty, property without due process of law. No, the state is not, the individual federal state is not allowed to run wild inside its own territory. The 14th Amendment makes specific the call that each state has the right and the duty to maintain a republican form of government, not a slave oligarchy and not a theocracy either, as Brigham Young attempted to create out there in Deseret. So, big day on the 22nd. Be proud of Lincoln, the greatest man of the 19th century, and somebody that we can learn from in the troubled times ahead. Now, the big news of the past few days, the National Anti-Austerity Committees, the National Anti-Austerity United Front, the Anti-Austerity United. Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking from Washington, D.C. Program being recorded here on Friday, the 21st of September, and this means that the first time you can hear this broadcast, it's going to be the 22nd of September, and a great day, the day that President Abraham Lincoln issued the pre-Emancipation Proclamation, the warning to the Confederate slavocrat power that unless they stopped their rebellion against the United States, slavery would be abolished in their territories. And of course, they refused to take the warning, and therefore the Emancipation Proclamation went into full force on January 1st, 1863. We just had in the past week, as we pointed out, on the 17th, a couple of days ago, the anniversary of the Antietam battle, not far from where I'm speaking to you from. The biggest single day's battle in American history in any war, World War I, World War II, does not matter. Antietam is bigger than any of them. It's also bigger than any of the individual days at Gettysburg or Shiloh or the Wilderness or Cold Harbor or any other battle. It's a landmark, and it's a landmark to the radicalization of the Civil War. If sacrifices like these are going to be made, then cabinet warfare cannot be the answer. It's got to be a principled struggle for profound social reform in the Confederate States so that hopefully the problem would not be repeated. Now, unfortunately, Lincoln was assassinated before he could win the peace with his concept of Reconstruction, which would have meant the industrialization of the southern states, breaking the slavocrat power with economic development and increase in population and land reform, I would say, for the newly freed slaves. In other words, the famous 40 acres and a mule, which was implemented by Sherman in certain areas when he could, destruction of the slavocrat power, the Confederate Freemasons, the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite, loyal to London and to imperialism. So that's setting the stage. October 27th, New York City, Tribeca, south of Canal Street, 56 Walker Street, will be the organizing conference or the initial organizing conference for the Anti-Austerity United Front. We've got to have a defensive line created before the month of December so that we can at least mount a propaganda resistance against Obama's grand bargain with the fascisto Republicans in the Congress, basically to destroy the New Deal entitlements, to strip you of your economic rights after running a campaign being friendly to the middle class. This is what you can expect. The knife will go into your back, and it will be done. He'll be eager to do it, as he said. So the moment is propitious. We've just had, of course, the collapse of Ron Paul. This thing has ended in ignominy. We're told that one of his top campaign officials, one of his nepotists, Jesse Benton, has now gone to work for Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell, the greatest plutocrat in the Senate, right? The guy who says that money is speech, and he wants no limits at all about the amount of money that can flow into the campaign coffers and indeed the pockets of his reactionary and fascistoid Republican confrere there in the Senate. So that's where parts of the Ron Paul campaign have ended up. This is the ignominious collapse of libertarianism, right, showing what it was all along. On the other hand, we've also just had the 1-year anniversary of the failed Occupy Wall Street. Now, I don't say this with any gloating, but I tried to salvage it before, during, and after with program, organization, leadership, and